So, this is going to be a high wire act. First, I've never given this talk before. It's been assembling itself with help from lots of people over the past month or so. I'll call out some of them in a moment. Second of all, we're going to use our older information management system, which has never been stress tested to the level that it has been for this presentation, and it's been made to do things that it was never designed to do. The third thing is we're going to demo for the very first time ever the new system that we've been working on, and I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, but we'll see how it comes out. It will be multi-collaborator, so we'll be working with my team back at Brown, and we'll see how that goes. It's an experiment, and you're all guinea pigs. Sorry about that, but I hope it will be worth it. Now, coming back to Toronto for me is in a sense carrying coals to Newcastle, because there are just so many people here. There's so much raw talent that works in this area. I've been in several labs so far, and I'll see more at Autodesk, and you guys are in the center of the world that examines human-computer interaction from novel points of view, and that's really neat. So let me start my pitch by giving you my introduction to Bill when he spoke at Brown, and there are two reasons for showing you. How many of you know what this artifact is? Not so many, huh? Okay, I need to set some context for you on how this talk came about by talking about this card, but I just want to read you the bottom of the introduction to give a little payback to my friend Bill. It says, if you can't read it, his visits always are exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. And that's kind of my measure of the man. It's wonderful to be in his orbit. All right, why did I want to show this punch card? I'm a dinosaur. I started to learn about computing in 1960, fresh out of college, where I was a transistor circuit designer. And I took this course on a lark, which was about digital computers. This is going to be hard for you guys to believe, but I didn't know what a digital computer was. I'd never even heard the phrase. So I took this course on a lark, and it changed my life. And I started working in information retrieval. And then I saw a video, which I'm going to show you in a moment after I do some acknowledgments. And then I'm going to come back to the card. In fact, I'll tell that story now. I grew up when, in the first course I took, that I just mentioned, we weren't even allowed to use the computer because it was too scarce a resource, and our code was in machine code. Zeros and ones. I'm not making this up. I commuted to Philadelphia from Brown University, just south of Boston, once a month to use the computer, the IBM 7040, on which I was doing my PhD research, as a personal computer for half an hour between 2 and 2:30 in the morning. Can you imagine getting on an airplane with boxes of cards, the cards I just showed you, just so I could get some personal debugging time on this computer? That's the age I grew up in. And I want to set that as the stage to show you how shocking it was to see the next thing I'll show you. But first, I really need to do my acknowledgments. My wonderful hosts and dear friends, sponsors, but I also want to thank Haijun and Fraser and Justin, who have been working their tails off to make this presentation come together on this AV equipment, and Shazab for the wonderful local arrangements, and of course Steve Sanders for sponsoring this wonderful seminar series. I'm reuniting with many old friends. George Fitzmaurice over here, Ron Becker, from whom I learned a lot. He doesn't appear in my talk, but I want to acknowledge him as one of the visionaries in our field. Okay, so the team back at Brown, whose chops I've been busting for much more than a month, Tyler, whose voice you will hear in a disembodied way, and a host of mostly undergraduates who've been working on this software. And most of all, my dear friend and person without whom I could not give presentations like this, Rosemary Simpson, who suffered the pain and anguish of using a system never designed to give a presentation like this, and tortured my chaotic thoughts into some coherence using the system. Thank you all very, very much. Now, what is this system? It's called DASH. It's meant to signify a dashboard to a lot of information that you can see I've laid out here on a unbounded two-dimensional workspace, a la Ken Perlin's Pad++. These are containers. They contain nested containers. We call them collections. I'll not take the time to explore because we are going to weave a trail through some 600 pieces of information that Rosemary and I collected over the past couple of months to build this talk. So think of this large 2D information space, and we're going to take a path through it. Now, just going back a little bit to my story. So I was in the world of punch cards doing information retrieval, and then I went to a seminar where this mind-blowing movie was shown. Remember, I took a plane to use a computer so I could put my cards in the card reader and get green striped paper out. Okay, and here's this guy. This is not Sutherland, by the way, that's Tim Johnson. And he's sitting at this organist console with all of these manipulators, and he has a pen in his hand, and he is drawing what seems to be directly on the screen, and he is creating objects which contain sub-objects. He can resize, he can rotate, he can put objects in objects and use them as masters to build additional copies called instances. All of this is happening at real time, and I just lost it seeing this thing. Oh my God, what we have been doing is crazy. We got to get into this world of interaction and communication with our computers through visual languages, input and output, the hand and fine motor skills. That's got to be the way in which communication has to go. So this inspired my life's work. And as Bill mentioned, I've had the great fortune to inspire a bunch of other people to get into this wonderful field. I'm bound to run over, so I'm going to skip the running of the movie, but I all encourage you to go to YouTube and see the actual drawing on the screen of those simple two-dimensional things. Later, they became three-dimensional, only line drawing, because we only had calligraphic vector drawing displays at the time. So, as I said, this changed my direction from information retrieval to interactive graphics. I didn't have a display, but I knew at some point I would get one. And I wrote this paper quite a long time ago, 64, when I was still in grad school. Displays in their use in man-machine interaction. That's what HCI was called back then. But it's human-computer interaction, and you can see perhaps online programming, computer-assisted instruction, computer-aided design. Those were the things that I thought graphics was going to be used for, and by God, it still is today. So, my life's work has been about computer graphics and hypermedia, and I'll show how those threads intertwine in just a moment. And I had the good fortune to attend a retelling of the story of MOAD last December. MOAD is the mother of all demos, a term I coined some years later after watching Doug Engelbart do his mind-blowing demo of the online system. I'll have a lot more to say about that in just a few minutes. And there have been celebrations at the 30th, 40th, and 50th milestone of that demo, which gave birth to the ideas that inspired Park, and from Park you can trace directly the influence to Apple, Microsoft, and everybody in the world, and we're still living with Doug Engelbart's legacy. But I didn't want the talk just to be about the themes of interactive graphics and hypermedia. I wanted to because of the reminiscences that came up at this workshop or symposium, which was very much focused on not just what has been accomplished, but what is still left to be done. I wanted to think back about the people who have inspired me, the ideas that have inspired me, and sort of try to figure out where are we with these ideas and with their synthesis. So I'm going to take you through 6 containers or buckets of information, starting, and I'm using slogans now, information at your fingertips. Show the picture of Bill Gates because he's identified with that slogan. But I'm going to show for all of these buckets some of the historical antecedents. It's not just information, it's how you structure and manage it. It's based largely on personal computing, having ubiquitous, or as I'll say shortly in Bill Buxton's sense, ubiquitous computing, computers and sensors everywhere. It's very much part of our environment. Connecting the world with the internet and social media. And finally, for me, the most interesting part was what I talked about in that paper. What is the human-computer interaction that makes all that stuff accessible to us? And I'll talk a little bit about the synthesis in terms of what we want. So, I'm going to examine each bucket in turn. Let's start with information at fingertips. Here's Bill Gates in a suit, very unusual. And I'm not going to ask you to read this whole thing, but what he's talking about in the computer over time will see what you're interested in, make that immediately available without your having to give any commands at all. And he describes all the kind of information that you want to have at your fingertips, and it should all be very easy. Well, yes, absolutely. Here's another mission statement from Google about organizing and making information available. Now, where are the antecedents of that idea of information at your fingertips? Bill didn't invent it, and neither did anybody living in the 19th or 20th century. You can say, for example, it started with the library at Alexandria, which unfortunately was burned down, and people have theorized about reconstructions. One thing that's clear, it was enormous. It was huge because it housed so many things. And well before digital computers, we had people who thought about how to organize the information. Here's a guy that most people have never heard about, a Belgian inventor, engineer, and incredible thinker called Paul Otlet. And he dreamed of a mechanical brain and how to index it. So here you see part of his workspace with all the cards that he was doing, and he was doing it well before digital computers, and he got amazingly far. Unfortunately, we couldn't make much use of his work in the modern world. Okay, can we advance, Tyler, on the next?
Yes. Hold on.
Yeah. So what you're seeing scrolling on the right is a set of all the assets as they appear in the path, and various keys that describe how they are to appear in the path. Say when.
Almost.
I don't know what I did to get us where we were, by the way. All right, thank you. Okay, our history doesn't start with Paul Otlet, although it should, and most of us trace our lineage back to Vannevar Bush, who wrote a landmark article in the July issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which was retypeset, and we'll make it available in a website that Rosemary's dying to work on with all of these assets in it. And it is an article that is a must for every computer science students, even if they're doing hardware. This is the one paper that you need to read, which anticipates not digital computers, but microfilm-based systems. But the ideas are technology independent to a very large extent. It has amazing ideas in it, and I'll come back to him in the next bucket. Another person whose name is not known, and you should know it, is J.C.R. Licklider. He theorized once digital computers were going to be widely available, which was not yet the case in the early 60s, what are we going to do with them to make information accessible So he talked about digital libraries of the future. It's not a smart move. I got it. I hope I didn't ruin any equipment with that. Okay. I mentioned that I was in information retrieval, and here's work I did for my master's thesis. I helped with a humongous warehouse that the Navy has with blueprints, and the blueprints are stored in little pieces of microfilm embedded in punch cards so that you get some amount of digital information, which you can, if there are tags, you can do Boolean retrievals on. And then I theorized about doing that same thing with ultrafiche, which is shown on the right-hand side. That little postage-size stamp piece of grainless microfilm is holding 1,200 pages of the King James Version of the Protestant Bible. And it has essentially infinite information density. So I thought that's the only way we're going to ever be able to store the world's information. I was dead wrong. Of course, it's now stored digitally, but we didn't know that at the time. Okay, information retrieval, information management, very closely related, so let's go into the information management bucket for a little while. I've always been interested in annotation, and when I would take books out of the library in college, I always would look for the oldest books because they had the most marginalia. And they were the most interesting books to me because seeing people's threaded discussions, comments on comments, I found a very useful way to understand what was important about the concept. Very old idea. For example, in the Middle Ages, 1500s, we have the Talmud, Talmudic disputation, which is commentary about commentary about commentary, and you see it indented in the margins, and even graphics back in the 1500s used to illustrate concepts. InfoViz, same thing with the King James Bible, 1611, and even in modern day writing. This is one of Rosemary's favorite authors, David Foster Wallace. On the right-hand side, if you can resolve it, you see writing, and then you see his own annotations and commentary on the left. And then just for grins, because I love this thing, this is the e-reader of its time. It's mechanical, and this is a book wheel. You'll notice it has open books on each little shelf, and there's a mechanical crank, so you can move from one window to the next, kind of a mechanical alt-tab, if you like. And this allows you to have multiple contexts open simultaneously, which is very important. Okay, I mentioned Bush. Let's dive a little deeper into the Bush story. I think you can read this quote. Can you read it back there? Yeah? All the way back? Good. Faster than my speaking it to you. He's talking about the information explosion, and we need mechanized means of dealing with it. So he theorized this gadget on the left, which is called a Memex. It was in a Life magazine version of the Atlantic Monthly article. And you'll notice that it's not read-only. It has these tablets on which, with a pen, you could actually draw things, and then the microfilm camera would record it and add it to the store of information. What resonated so much with me in Bush was his talk about how we remember things, how we recall things by association, not by being on linear paths. And we all know about associative memories. It happened that I did my PhD dissertation on a system that mimicked associative memory using list processing techniques. So I really thought, yes, of course, that's how we want to organize and retrieve information. And he talks about how we can do that mechanically, following an associative trail from one concept to a related other concept. When the user is building a trail, he names it, inserts the name in a code book, and taps it out on his keyboard. Well, today we point and click, but the idea is very similar. And then he goes to talk about trail building, which is very important. It's people who organize the materials so that you don't drown in this vast ocean of raw materials, but you get a guided tour through some of the important things, and of course you can condition the tour. Thus, he builds a trail of interest through the maze of materials available, and the trail does not fade. He forecast wholly new forms of encyclopedias. Wikipedia, anyone? ready, made with a mesh of associate trails running through them. There it is, that whole vision right there. And then the thing that didn't happen is a new profession of trailblazers, people who would specialize in building these guided tours. And it's sad because that would be very interesting. Okay, now we come to the Ur pioneer who was inspired as a sailor in an island on the South Pacific during the war years to think about the same thing Otlet had been thinking about. How do you organize information? Read the Bush article and said, wow. But he already had heard about digital computers. And so he and his team at Stanford Research Institute built this amazing system called NLS, and everyone should go online and see the mother of all demos, because even today you can still learn from it. His philosophy on how to handle information is laid down in this Stanford Research Institute report. I'm now going to go into one of the assets, which is the full PDF of that report. Notice I didn't have to open a PDF viewer. And you can just quickly read this. The key phrase is augmenting human intellect. That was his ultimate goal. Tools are tools, and he spent an incredible amount of effort and the government's money with his team building the best tools we ever had. But those tools were in the service of this larger goal of lifting us all up, and he called that raising our collective IQ. Okay, more rapid comprehension, better comprehension, more insight, and so on, because you have information at your fingertips. And here's another wonderful phrase or paragraph: a research program, a conceptual framework. So he didn't just build tools, he didn't just implement stuff, it was grounded on a really well-articulated intellectual framework, primarily about what the goals were all about. So here are some of the people in his team, and what I want to do next is just play a little bit of video for you and talk about the many contributions of NLS, which, as I said earlier, contributions that we're still living by. So, interactive authoring and reading on screens. Engelbart was for knowledge work what Sutherland was for computer-aided design. So Engelbart was interested in teams doing productivity work. So let me play just one of the little clips here. Let's hope the AV works. We need a little more audio. Can one of our audio wranglers get us more audio? Can we get more out of the sound system? I'll stop the video. Yeah. Can you hear this in the back? So he's drawing through his video composition system. He is showing himself. And by the way, this is all being projected on something like a 20-foot screen in the auditorium, driven by an Ida-4 projector, which I'd only read about. I had never, and none of the other people had ever seen, a screen that big showing interaction with a computer. So the demo itself was dramatic beyond belief, which is why I called it the mother of all demos. We will never be able to spend that kind of money and effort on a single demo again. So, interactive authoring on reading and authoring having the same importance. I seem to be stuck, Tyler. Okay. I'm not, okay, here we go. Outlining, which we all use with hyperlinks between statements, multiple windows, real-time teleconferencing, and working together, and I'll show you a little piece of that in just a moment. And of course, the only thing people remember him for, the mouse, which is probably the least important of his inventions, and the keyboard on the left-hand side. So I'm running over like mad, so I won't show all these videos. I just want you to know that what you saw was his manipulating all the elements of an outline, doing word processing the way we do with cut and paste, copy and paste, going places to get additional information. It was in its own way as mind-blowing as Sutherland's Sketchpad thesis was. Truly amazing. One of the things that appealed to me is links were not special little things. They were visible as text, which you could edit, like today's URLs. He and his team practiced, as far as I know, better than anyone else at the time, systematic architecture, systematic software engineering, systematic development, and then bootstrapping use of tools. In fact, he talked about the bootstrap community, building tools that were used for building tools, empowering people who could then build faster tools, a totally virtuous circle. Amazing. Contemporary, my college classmate Ted Nelson, who coined the word hypertext and spent his entire life evangelizing it, who in his various writing tackled very complex issues of how you read actively. Reading is always active. You're annotating, you're commenting, you're linking, you're seeing and building relationships and memorializing them in the system. So he wrote a lot and talked a lot how to do that. He, for the first time, ever thought about how do you have a trail of authorship where people borrow each other's writings, alter them slightly. How do you figure out where that trail started and where it ends, and how you compensate people for the use of their intellectual property? He wrote extensively. These books are still very interesting reading, Computer Lib and Dream Machines. And he coined the memorable phrase of computers are the wave of the future, which in the 60s was still a proposition that you had to talk about. That wasn't an accepted fact. Then displays are the surfboards. And I thought that was wonderfully evocative. He and I collaborated with some of my undergraduates on a system that was contemporary with Engelbart's called the hypertext editing system. And that's a picture from 1968. A light pen on an IBM 2250 display, a box of function keys on the left, bimanual operation, one of Bill Buxton's favorite themes, also exhibited by Sutherland with his setup at Lincoln Labs. And we were using it for doing both hypertext experimentation and what we now call word processing. And that led to a series of systems at Brown, which I'm not going to talk about in the interest of time. Just want to mention that our interest in tabletop displays and other large format touchscreens resulted in our system being used by the Nobel Foundation for a traveling exhibition on the Nobel laureates and Nobel's writings and his very interesting history with hyperlinks and additional material. Okay, large jumps in time. I cannot begin to do an exhaustive history. I'm not a historian. I'm not a history of technology sort of person. So forgive the gaps, forgive the omissions. I'm going to jump straight to the World Wide Web and Sir Tim, who gave us the first open and universal hypertext system, which caused hypertext for the first time ever to be usable at scale. The systems we build at Brown, Engelbart's system, they were not at scale. They served small working groups. They didn't serve the universe. Whatever you think of the limitations of his vision of hypertext, and there are many, nonetheless, the fact is it operates at scale, and that is truly remarkable. What we did lose What we did lose is something that Engelbart and Ted and I and others working in the early days firmly believed in, that there shouldn't be any distinction between active reading and authoring the same activity. That changed for various reasons with today's system. And just by sheer coincidence, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of WWW, which ushered in the modern age of computing for knowledge work, entertainment, social communication, and so on. Okay, that's as much as I'm going to say about him, and now I want to spend a little time on how we think about information and how we deal with this explosion of stuff. First, we have to find it, but finding is only the first step. How do you organize it? And Engelbart pioneered the use of outline editing and hierarchy, still a most prevalent form of structuring. Rosemary and I like to lay things out spatially, kind of like a messy desktop that transcends the desktop and goes into the room, and then transcends the room and goes into multiple rooms. And there are a few whiteboarding applications. Many people like to arrange things on timelines. That's a chronological form. Tables are very well done these days in multiple tools. Graphs, not so much. Getting a view of your complicated hypertext, no, there are no good user-friendly graph viewing algorithms out there that I know about. And what we've learned is that building these graphs by manually inserting links is still important, but most people don't bother. They just search and use just-in-time results, and it is truly astonishing how well that works these days. Both Google, Bing, and probably others give you really terrific literal text searching capability. You can search over images, and it works in fractions of a second, which is quite remarkable. PageRank and many other algorithms, but server strategies and distributed computing, it all goes in there. And most recently, it's been aided by machine learning techniques, and this is a paper written, co-authored by Peter Norvig, one of my TAs from the early days, about the unreasonable effectiveness of data. Large amounts of data can let you do machine learning over that data, and that has a ton of different uses, even in places where you wouldn't have thought of it as a pattern recognition problem, such as getting machine learning programs to learn how to play games by just knowing what success and failure is without any notion of strategy. They discover it, also used now for protein folding, which is very important to, for example, cancer research. So just-in-time search for most of us is substitution for having hardwired links, but I always follow links in Wikipedia and other places that I consult. As good as search is, I claim it's still in its infancy, and I laugh at how badly it still works without personal assistants, so-called. And that's partially because these assistants know nothing about us. They don't know our history, our preferences. They have no context. They don't even have common sense reasoning capabilities. So I bought a smart speaker a week ago just to try it out. And on Wednesday night, I said, "Hey, Google, what's the weather in Toronto early next week?" Anybody have any trouble with that query? Do you know what I meant? It could have said, "Which Toronto do you mean?" It didn't. It said, "Here's the weather forecast for Thursday of this week." Okay, did not know how to deal with it. I tried 3 different ways to get this information, gave up. And then the following day, I heard, "Hey, you know, you can use your smart speaker for taking notes," which I love doing. Regardless of where I am, I always want to carry something on which I can take notes. Being able to do that hand-free sounds really good to me. But I don't know how to do it, so I say, "Hey, Google, how do I create notes?" And Google tells me, essentially, "I just made a note of what you said." And I said, no. "Hey, Google, how do I tell you to make a note?" I tried 6 different ways. It didn't work. I couldn't ask, "How do I read back a note? How do I get a note from you?" None of it worked. So I gave up. I still don't know how to do it. Somebody here can probably tell me. So, looking back, where are we? I claim that if you look at Engelbart's vision, office productivity is great. Something just popped up. Thank you. We can do screen sharing, but what I saw on the screen that was part of the blowing away the audience exercise was he worked in real time with a collaborator in Menlo Park, San Francisco, Menlo Park, 30 miles apart. They saw each other taking control of the cursor, and they worked completely collaboratively. We're going to show that minus the video inset because we don't have that technology a little bit later in this talk. So we have very good office productivity suites. They interoperate between the elements of the suite very well, but they don't cooperate with each other because that's not in the interest of the people who build those suites. We have lots of silos, and I'll say that over and over again. Yeah, we have wonderful access to information via search. It's amazing because of miraculous scaling. I never in a million years would have predicted it is as good as it is. But here's some problems. Most of it is not curated. I don't have a trusted point of view. Information all looks the same on the screen. And I can't tell conspiracy theory from science just by looking at it. So I always want to know what's the background of the person who wrote it. Bush's vision of encyclopedias, yes, we got that. But trails and trailblazers, not much. Links, yeah, we got links, but that's different from having trails. And the main goal, which was to raise our collective IQ, I submit that most certainly hasn't happened. So, we now go to the third slogan and the third bucket, personal computing. Very straightforward. This was radical at the time, folks. This idea of personal computing ran completely counter to the computing environment, which is a mainframe, big building, priesthood kind of life form back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And other people have written about this. There are basically two historical trends that come together. The obvious one of micro-miniaturization, which again, I didn't foresee, and the foment of the 60s, the rebellion against authority, the hippie movement. Look at these hippies. That's early Microsoft. And I just want to point out the geek on the far bottom left, that's Bill Gates, who looks about 12 years old. And Paul Allen, who unfortunately departed and was an amazing person. And in the back, with the long hair and the beard, was the guy who was my main designer on Fres, my second hypertext system, starting in '68. And he took a lot of those ideas into what he did. At Microsoft, he also invented shareware because he was a hippie and he didn't believe in making money off software. So he was a cool guy. Dropped more acid than I would like, but okay. So Whole Earth Catalog, still a good read today. It was part of the anti-establishmentarianism of the day. And I just want to show this because many people have not seen this. How many people have seen this? Okay, most of you have. Well, there's sufficient number that I think I can afford to. It's very short. When this came out, it was really shocking. This is the day of IBM's hegemony, the priesthood, the multi-million-dollar machine, and personal computing was barely in its infancy. We're going to need good sound here, guys. You'll have to forgive me. I have familial tremor, and even operating a mouse is quite difficult for me. Okay, we need sound way up. This is a Super Bowl commercial, so it was seen by tens of millions of people. Even if you can't really resolve it, I think you can see what's going to happen. It's one of the best commercials ever.
Introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Okay. So it was a different world, and it wasn't really oriented yet to personal computing. Here's a short, non-inclusive list of some major inventors. We've already talked about Bush and Sutherland and Engelbart. Bob Taylor got the money to start Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. It was populated by absolute wizards. One of the head wizards is my dear friend Alan Kay, with whom I was on this panel last December, which got me in this reflective mood, which resulted in this talk, and he with Doug Goldberg and a host of other people built the Smalltalk environment, which we are still the beneficiaries of today, even though none of us probably uses Smalltalk. But the idea of having that integrated environment that is based on objects all the way down, that's still very much part of our tech stack. And then the people who build the hardware, the Alto, which was the first really good bitmapped graphics workstation. But it's not about the hardware as much, at least not for me. It's about what you do with it. And here's this crazy guy, Alan Kay, in 1969, before personal computers, decades away still, thinking about where micro-miniaturization might go and thinking about these portable laptop-like thingies that you could use in the outdoors and that were based on interactive graphics and simulation. That's the Dynabook. That's the vision on which the Smalltalk environment was built in, and that's a vision that we're still trying to realize today. Among the things that make the personal computing revolution happen was not just the hardware, but the apps that ran on it. And the killer app in those days was VisiCalc, which was the spreadsheet. All of our spreadsheets are still based on Bricklin and Franklin's Visit. A person you've probably never heard of is the father of the IBM PC, which was the PC before Apple built up its huge empire. And of course, we all know the Steve Jobs story. So where are we today with the personal computing revolution? We all have laptops and smartphones. Even in poor countries, they can now afford cheap smartphones, and without much infrastructure, they can communicate and get resources, and that's fabulous that in these places where they couldn't afford to build the kind of first world infrastructure that we have, nonetheless, the technology can help them do what we can do in the first world. And we are fortunately lowering the barriers to entry based on age, income, and a lot of other factors. So that's all goodness. One of the major uses is symbolized by Mark and his original vision. And we'll talk a lot about that at the end of the course. So where are we now with this Connect the World vision? Well, we got great plumbing, and it usually works, not always, and sometimes it takes a team of 3 people with PhDs and beyond to make the stuff work, but most of the time it does work, and that's great. It's an astonishing feat of engineering, however bad you think it is at times, and here are some of the names of people who build the backbone, and Berners-Lee for the web. So one of the most recent uses, growing exponentially, is all this social media stuff. And I'll come back to this, which haunts me. Yes, we can physically connect 3 billion people, but an awful lot of the uses of that ability are not ones that I'm particularly fond of. They divide people, they create bubbles. And we'll come back to this theme. Fifth theme, and you'll notice I'm skating very lightly over some themes. I can't spend equal time on all of them. Ubiquitous computing associated with the unfortunately far too early departed Mark Weiser at Xerox Palo Alto. Bill had the privilege and pleasure of being part of that team and designing some of their interaction surfaces, which is a fabulous thing to have on your resume. And the idea is simple: smart everything, everywhere, all the time, ambient intelligence, Internet of Things, and so on. And I just want to talk about one project that I worked on with some wonderful collaborators, sponsored by the National Science Foundation and the Science and Technology Center on telecollaboration. Bill and George and others sitting in the audience have equally deep, if not deeper, experience with telecollaboration in the lab this morning. I saw more stuff. Here was a vision, and this was a cartoon that was drawn in the early 90s, and we were able to do some of it. Henry Fuchs, University of North Carolina, the flaming red hair. Collaborators at University of Utah, Rich Riesenfeld and Elaine Cohen, here ready to go out for the evening, who are experts in NURB technology, describing geometry and then machining it. And they're figuring out how to build a new head mount display. Then there are remote collaborators that are all around the virtual room, and we thought about how we blend virtual and real rooms, and we got somewhere with this vision, but I think it largely, except for good video these days, remains in the research space. Ubicomp, I've changed what it means based on being converted by Bill to his view of the world. Think of me as Buxton Light. In the lecture that he gave here, he talked about the importance of place in a rich sense of place. He talked about the sociology term moral order, knowing what is appropriate in what context, in what place. I usually use the term context. I think we know, we pretty much mean the same thing by our separate terms. It's not just about the physical constraints, it's also about the knowledge of person, group, indeed society and culture. That all has to be factored in to our dialogues. So where are we with this? Well, we got exponential growth. It's a $50 billion industry. But this vision that the little cartoon showed, I don't know of any place where it's being used in production. We have approximations in research labs. And one of the hard problems is the integration problem. You've got this stream of data, and I'm going to characterize it in more detail in a little bit, coming in, and the idea is that you have to do data fusion. How do you unify it? How do you make sense of everything that you're learning? And do it in a way that protects privacy and has elements of security. And this is where I basically went off the rails for the last 3 weeks trying to prepare this talk as I learned about these books and bought them and read them and was shocked, frankly. I want to show these physically, and I encourage you to come up and look at them if you haven't read them or seen them. I didn't know how much of a surveillance state we are in at this point, how much listening is going on. I knew that information is forever now, and you can't ever erase anything anymore, but I didn't know the uses to which it was put, so I'm going to finish up the talk by pontificating about that in a little while. This last point about our appliances on the Internet of Things, one of my most recent PhD students, Joe Laviola, who some of you know from his work on MathPad, which we did for Microsoft Research, and he's still working on gesture recognition and physics problems and math problems. He was telling me the story last week when he spent a couple of days with us of he and his wife talking about a car that they might want to have. And he goes to his study in the next room, and there's an ad for that car based on the smartphone, smart speaker having listened all the time and being on 24/7. He turned it off, and I'm going to turn off my Google Home after I get home. I think it is way too intrusive, and I don't know what uses it's going to be put to. Okay, next bucket. Can we get rid of the, yeah, thank you. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes here, because it's the one of all these buckets that I've been the most occupied with, and I can't begin to do justice to it. Now I'm Wigdor light and not just Buxton light. I'm going to skate over it quite quickly. So, Sketchpad blew me away, in part because of the interaction. It wasn't that he was showing graphics on the screen, it's that he was creating it in real time and was interacting with, in effect, a virtual world that lay behind the screen. I've done a lot of work in the past in VR and AR, not going to talk about it, because you had a great lecture from Steve Feiner, my PhD student who worked on this stuff when he was at Brown already. Okay, so what are the parts that interest me? First of all, going back to basics and saying, what is the role of a UI? Why do we have UIs at all? And I claim it's an intermediary between what I want to do and the environment that I want to learn from and manipulate. Increasingly today, it's about managing complexity, and I want the experience to be pleasant, to be harmonious. Japanese and Chinese have good words for harmony in an environment. So one could ask, all right, as an intermediary, what do you want? No user interface, perhaps? Something that many of us have thought. They're a necessary evil. And then we have musicians like Bill and many others I know who say there's nothing more satisfying than to hold a well-crafted tool or a well-crafted instrument and be in harmony with it, play it in the full sense of the word play. And so the aesthetics of a good UI are a counterpoint. What we want from the UI is to be able to interact with a real world of real and virtual objects, tasks, other participants. And so when I theorize about what it would be nice to have in a home assistant, unlike Siri and Cortana and all the others, Alexa, I think of P.G. Wodehouse. How many have read the P.G. Wodehouse stories? Anybody here? Just a few people. Okay. British author wrote amusing, formulaic plots about an upper-class twit named Bertie Wooster. Think the Python's Twits video, in case you haven't seen it. It's a terrible satire of upper-class twits, but Bertie's a nice man. He just doesn't know what he wants, and he can't manage his life, and Jeeves, the perfect butler, does that for him. Knows exactly what Bertie needs, what he likes, because he knows Bertie's context and his place in the Buxton sense. And he can anticipate what Bertie needs before Bertie even thinks of it, and he can infer his intent and provide advice at the right time, in the right way, suited for Bertie. It's of course based on perfect natural language understanding and a huge common knowledge base, world knowledge. Okay, vision in essentially funny fiction. Here is a much closer vision, as yet unrealized, I claim, embedded in the Knowledge Navigator, which is one of the good things that John Sculley did when he was CEO, replacing Steve Jobs. This is a vision video. I'll play a little bit of it. Please amp up the sound if you can. So we now have music playing. Is there anything we can do to amp this up? It's at 100. It's at 100. Is there anything we can do here? Because the dialogue is really important. No, that's max. Sorry, folks, I have no control over the AV here. This is a faculty member, and he is having a natural language interaction with this little bow tie personal assistant. I'm going to stop the video because we can't hear it. I apologize. So I'll just tell you what's happening. The assistant knows the faculty member's life, knows his calendar, knows what appointments are important, knows what colleagues are important, knows what data to pull up. In one of the most beautiful little pieces of this professionally acted video, he says, "Give me the papers I haven't read yet on such and such a subject." And the assistant comes back and says, "Do you mean this or would you like this? And so there's this natural language dialogue based on a deep shared context. And then the assistant puts up graphs and supplies just-in-time information, and it all works seamlessly because it's a promo video. It's not the real world. But it's a vision that Scully wanted to drive Apple to, and we're nowhere near there today. Now, of course, with our agents, some of you will remember another 50th anniversary. So I've mentioned MOAD. Oh, by the way, Sutherland at that very same fall joint computer conference talked about virtual reality and the system he'd been building with Bob Sproul and others. So that's another anniversary, and we had a big party at SIGGRAPH for him and that vision. And the third was the showing of 2001, which is a monumental movie that everybody should see. It's like Citizen Kane. You got to see it. And the computer goes bad, basically. Okay, what of this vision of the most perfect interface exists today? At best, transparency, so I don't think about it. And that means I minimize my cognitive load, and that is often done by shifting from cognitive processing to perceptual processing, and where I can use muscle memory and learned interactions without engaging my brain. That's the best we can do today. In the future, brain interfaces. This is a very invasive one, pioneered at Brown a decade ago, where they literally insert a little chip that measures the output from 100 neurons. We were talking this morning with Ali and Bill about the skull cap, and he can tell you more about that after I finish, which is measuring much weaker signals, and you hope for non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. And the idea is simple, that you think and the right action happens. Cogito ergo fac, that's how it's pronounced, my Latin knowing friends tell me. I think, therefore it happens. And that has all kinds of interesting problems associated with it. But a lot of people are interested in these direct interfaces. Well, what do we got today? We got mostly WIMP. WIMP is designed for this one-eyed, one-fingered, taped up individual, which has no sensory awareness of the user at all, except when he or she presses a key, and deterministically we can determine which key was pressed, and that doesn't take much computing horsepower. I started in the 90s, early 90s, writing about what I'd already seen in multiple places, which I thought of as the post-WIMP world. WIMP for Windows icons, menus, and pointer device, of course, invented at PARC. Okay, these are often called multimodal UIs, perceptual UIs, and Daniel has written a book on it, and he and his people practice it. Natural, whatever that means. To me, it means effortless and seamless and transparent and minimal cognitive load. But the key idea here, which is what distinguishes it from WIMP, is that it's multimodal simultaneously. So back to the stuff that Bill was working on in the 70s with bimanual operation, which is what musicians do, what we do in the real world. We walk, we talk, we see, we pick things up, we write with one hand, and we touch something with the other hand. WIMP interfaces don't do that. The problem with it is we got all these channels coming in, streaming in high bandwidth data, and we got to recognize it and disambiguate it. And it's all based on probabilistic recognition. Our speech recognizers still aren't nearly good enough, neither are individual gesture recognizers. And this probabilistic disambiguation is hard, and unifying two weak signals and drawing a stronger kind of autocorrelated conclusion from them is not a simple task. So I'm going to talk about unification for a minute in just a few, but I want to say here too, we're building on a body of stuff that was done earlier. Sutherland, Engelbart, the PARC environment I've mentioned. By the way, just so we all remember, Pen computing was born in the mid-60s. Okay? And touch displays date from the mid-60s with this wonderful time-sharing system called Play-Doh, which did computer-assisted instruction with text and graphics and was wholly interactive. Mid-60s. Okay. Then, skipping lots of developments, we have this wonderful startup called Go with lots of brilliant people in it saying, if we're going to do pen computing in this probabilistic disambiguation, we got to build everything from the ground up, kind of like the vision of the Smalltalk group, which build everything, every tool integrated, building on the ideas from Engelbart about integrated tools and systems. And it was used in the first IBM ThinkPad with a stylus, and unfortunately that didn't sell well, and PenPoint eventually went under, but their patents are still very important and their ideas are very novel. Then we get Newton from Apple, which was too early, ahead of its time. The Palm Pilot with a stylus and graffiti. How many old farts like me remember using the Palm Pilot with graffiti? Wasn't that a great gadget? It really worked. By the way, graffiti is centuries old. It's an early writing system. They didn't invent it. And for all of this stuff, if you want a serious historian of technology, talk to Bill. It's not me. We build a bunch of systems starting in the 2000s after we started working with MSR on tablets. We build handwriting music with gesture recognition and playing it back, handwriting mathematics, a two-dimensional language, which has resulted in a little company that sells it to high schools called Fluidity Software. We did it for chemistry. We did it for sketching drawings. And so we're big believers in pen computing. Let me summarize where we are today with post-WIMP UIs. Well, we're not going to get rid of WIMP interfaces. Keyboards and mice are going to be here forever, but pen and touch is very strong in certain industries. Creative industries use pens all the time on their surfaces, and we all, I bet, use smartphones with touch and increasingly with pen. Game controllers are certainly post-WIMP. Gestures on various surfaces, an early tabletop from Microsoft. And Connect, which died unfortunately. We used it, as many people did, for research because it was great for gestures in air, but also from capturing environments. Speech is still in its infancy, I believe, and question answering is ridiculous. They fixed this, by the way. They got hit so many times. I tried it again on my iPhone. They now say something sensible about the mother, but then every variant of the question, how are babies conceived, who makes babies, and stuff like that, it's always the mother. That's the one answer they have. So it's not a lot better. I love augmented reality with smartphones or headgear. Here we have an example of Eric Horvitz, who many of you know for his work in AI and ethics, and he's had a lively interest in agents. And here we have face recognition and a smart agent that can deal with the context provided by the visitors and show them around. Ubicomp at Xerox, but also roots in Olivetti and the park in London and so on. Lots of cool history there. And for history buffs, go and look for this stuff online. Two guys sitting in a room with commodity equipment, and they are able to point in air to objects on the screen and say, put that there, where that is a ship that they're pointing to, and there is a destination location. They have a dialogue with the computer and with themselves, and at one point in the video, the computer said, "Do you agree, Eric?" And Eric says, "Yes, I do," and the computer executes. We're still working on that idea. Here's Wang Freestyle, one of Bill's favorites. Here's a guy who's gonna take a spreadsheet, mark it up in real time, voice record over it, and then send the whole thing, the annotated spreadsheet with his voice recording, to his colleagues for further processing. And here's a 15-year-old project of my student Annie Forsberg in our virtual reality cave. He's wearing lightweight head-tracked stereo glasses. He has a PDA in his hand. He's issuing voice commands, and he is navigating the surface of Mars based on our reconstruction of Mars data that we got from the GEO people that do Martian exploration and that we worked with. I want to show you, as my last point in this NUI bucket, a little bit of how you might do this unification idea. So again, the idea is you have probabilistic reasoning and you believe some outcome, some fact, and then you have another channel that may or may not believe the same thing, and you want to unify those beliefs, and those beliefs are generated by speech, gesture, pose, eye gaze, what have you. And it's a form of sensor fusion, and I will skip all of the math. I'll just show you what it looks like visually, and this is from a paper that is in review, so I can't tell you the authors or give you any other information, but I hope it gets accepted. It's cool work. So you start, and there's a heavy use of machine learning as well as hand-trained models. You start with equal beliefs, i.e. probabilities of recognition of these devices. They're cups and markers and other things in front of the robot, and the object is to work with the robot so that it can pick up an object, the right one, and put it someplace, do something with it. So it very much involves action and not just recognition, and they use a particular form of hidden Markov models called POMDPs, and that integrates action with observation. Okay, so we take these probabilistic beliefs, and the higher the blue bar, the higher the belief, up to 1, which is certainty, which of course never happens. And for this particular exercise, it has about equal probabilities for the second marker and a spoon. And then it has more language with which the human trainer of the robot is instructing. And then what happens is that we combine the reasoning from the gesture, the in-air gesture, with the language specifics. And you'll notice that with the gesture component, marker 2 wins. Well, it's about equal with spoon 1. But on the right-hand side, language, it's marker 1 and marker 2. So you say best out of 2. If 2 different channels agree that it's likely to be marker 2, that's what we're going to pick. And you raise the combined probability for marker 2. And then you do time integration so that you take successive steps and average them as well. And that's a multimodal belief system. I have a little video, which I won't have time to play. Okay, what do we actually want in our NUI? This is a wish list, and it's a research agenda. We want ubiety. We want agile switching when we're doing multi-threading. When I'm in the shower, I am working on multiple threads simultaneously. I want a display that works in the shower. I want to be able to walk from the shower into the closet, get dressed, walk to the kitchen, make breakfast, or have Bill make it for me, as he did this morning. Thank you, Bill. Never lose my train of thought, be completely immersed in my task or tasks, and the system has to keep track of me. Bill does this rant way better than I do, but you get the picture. You want to be location independent, weather independent, context independent, and yet context sensitive, because I can't carry on the same dialogue in the kitchen where my wife is as I can by myself in the shower, let alone in a carpool, let alone when I'm in a busy office environment. So that sense of place that Bill talks about is truly important. But I want to have this interaction so it's continuous over the entire spectrum of time and place, and we can't do that at all. My standard example, for 30 years, I used to be able to tell my young kids, hey, we're having Bill over for dinner, set the table, please. And that would result in their knowing that the better china comes out, the wine glasses come out, how many people are at the table. They have the context, and they can reverse engineer that macro, that intent. We are so far away from being able to do that because they've been focusing on language models, which is great. You absolutely need to do that. But it's just the beginning, and the knowledge base and the common sense reasoning, which they're also working on, has to advance a lot better. So this idea of your little bow tie assistant who works in the background and does useful stuff for you, the way Rosemary does, a real person who knows me, we are way further away from that than we are from autonomous vehicles even. Now, here's another problem. We're going to all be wearing 1,000 devices very soon. I carry 2 smartphones. I have the studio, I have the tablet in my briefcase. There's another computer here somewhere, but that's only 5 computers. What happens when we have embedded stuff inside us? And when our sensor-rich environment with cameras and touch surfaces, how do we integrate all that stuff? How on earth do we form situational awareness and focus on where we should be focusing? TBD. So what we want a lot is how we manage the scarcest commodity, which is intention. And here's a book on it that Rosemary really likes. I love Tristan Harris's TED Talk. I recommend you watch it. It forms the basis of some of what I'm talking about. Notice the word addiction appearing. And just recently I talked to my colleague Mary Zawinski at MSR, and she's talking about how the work of her group is starting to influence products that make it possible for you to get rid of or at least moderate notifications and stuff like that in a smart way. I'm going to switch topics. Ye gods. Guys, are you ready for New Dash's maiden voyage?
Yep. Can you hear us?
Something has to happen on the AV panel so we can hear you. Tyler, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Yes, perfectly. Take it away. So this is a variation of the system I've just been using. And it too is a 2D information management system where you can pour in all your assets, web clippings that preserve the HTML, build hierarchy of document containers like a file hierarchy, make hyperlinks, annotate, search. Search is really important because, as I said, there are over 600 assets in the collection just for this talk. I'm going to talk about ethics as my wind-up. Okay. So we're looking at a workspace. Ignore the UI. This code is literally hours old. It is so hot off the press, it's smoking. And what he's doing, are you going to narrate?
I can narrate. What we're doing here is there's a really bad. I'm just showing that we have a collection of different media types. We have web pages, images, PDF documents. We can take them and create collections out of them and view those collections in different ways. So this is something that looks perhaps more like a file system view, where you can get a preview of a document. So you could also think of this somewhat like Google Docs for multimedia documents, where you want to perform workflows, not just operate on individual documents. So another example would be, if you wanted to take a note on a document, you can start typing, and you might want to link that note to one of the items in the workspace. So we can do that.
So,
I'm having some trouble doing this over the...
while he's doing that, I'm connected via the browser to exactly the same session. So we're duplicating what Doug Engelbart was doing in 1968. And we can have as many people as we like on that session working together.
And so this is just an example of how you can then follow those links. We have a docking workspace that you can rearrange things. And again, this is all pretty new work for us. But what's exciting about it is that it is all based on a client architecture where we can be collaborating in real time with documents, multimedia documents like this. We can do annotations of them and scribbling. So I can be doing this either as I'm doing it now on Andy's computer, or this is connected to our machine at Brown. So now these updates are coming from Brown. So I think that's all we can really demo at the moment, but
Okay,
hopefully a teaser of the direction that we're moving in.
yeah. Thank you very much. Can we go back to the slideshow? Which isn't a slideshow at all. These are just documents on the workspace, and if I had time, I would open up any of these buckets. We could zoom in arbitrarily. The PDFs are live. The web clippings are live, so you can follow URLs. So this is not a static Pinterest board, for example. That's very important. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to cut the whole tail section, which grieves me sore, and I'm just going to skip the slides. Yeah, I'll skip all this. This is a summing up of where we are, and talk about the thing that has really been preoccupying me, societal impact and ethics. So I've been, for the last few years, in my intro course, been talking about, in the first 2-3 minutes, I have about 400 students in that intro Java with graphics course, about what I call IT in the news. And I talk about cyber fraud, and I talk about self-driving cars and the pros and cons of that, about the huge problems with data breaches. I read yesterday 2 billion records were stolen. 2 billion with really serious data in them. It's just unbelievable. But what I wasn't really talking about a lot is what social media are doing. I say everything you ever put on the web is forever. Be careful. Don't waste all your time Facebooking. I prefer you not to Facebook while you're listening to me in class, but if you must, go ahead. I've seen my grandkids get hooked. So I've been concerned, but not until I read these books that I have the crap scared out of me. And I strongly recommend you read them. Don't necessarily believe everything in there, but on the whole, it's a problem. And why is it a problem? Because we don't really think about the implications of Kranzberg's first law. Never heard of Kranzberg until I watched Bill's Ubiety talk here, and he gave a variant of that talk at Brown. Technology isn't neutral. That's what I've always said. And if you control it, everything is fine. Okay, I want to tell you about this, which I think summarizes our attitude. This is Tom Lehrer. He was a mathematician at Harvard who made a much better living than teaching mathematics to students who didn't want to learn it as a humorist, songwriter, and performer. Listen to the lyrics. Oh, AV again, yeah. Oh, good, that's better.
Gather round while I sing you of Werner von Braun, a man whose allegiance is ruled by expedience. Call him a Nazi, he won't even frown. Nazi schmazi, says Werner von Braun.
Everybody knows who Werner von Braun was? He built the V2 rockets that were used against London.
Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun.
Okay, not my department, says Werner von Braun. That's how we technologists mostly act. We build better stuff, and how other people use it is their problem and society's problem. And this kind of ridiculous techno-optimism fueled the computer revolutions that I've talked about, fueled the phenomena that is known as Silicon Valley. And I think we've been dead wrong in taking no responsibility for what we build and not even considering the harm to which it could be put. Okay, I'm going to be on my soapbox for 2 minutes and then I'm done. What these books are about, basically, is to say we've been hacked. We've been hacked by free, which leads us to use social media far too much and exposes all of our information, which is hoovered up and then combined with information taken from other apps, from the universe of data that is out there for us. And that leads to psychology predicted behavior characterization, modeling your psychological profile, which leads to being able to predict how you're going to react to stimuli, ads, and fake news, and then even can cause behavior modification by feeding you disinformation or, at best, limited information. It is a vicious cycle, and I mean vicious in the literal sense of the word. It's driven by the profit motive. I'm a capitalist. I've been part of 20 startups. I love free enterprise, but what we have today is robber baron capitalism. And here's a fact. Mark Zuckerberg votes about 60% of the stock of Facebook. And Facebook controls the news feeds and the social circles with help from the users of close to 2 billion people, and if you throw in all the other networks. So here you have one guy whose policy utterances and whose policies dictates govern the daily lives of 2 billion people. That's more power than even Trump has. And a lot of it is not used for social good. So what I'm advocating is not just natural user interface design or universal interface design, but something that I just learned about a few weeks ago, humane design, which covers not just interfaces, but all kinds of things. And my summary of it is, you can't just decide what is goodness for an individual or maybe for a group. You have to ask yourself, this thing that I'm designing, that I want other people to build or that I'm going to build myself, is it societally useful? Can I anticipate both the good social consequences and the unanticipated harmful consequences? So it has to take into account a much broader context. And a lot of the design is for fostering addiction. Think video games. It's all about time on task, which also works for ads. The more time you spend looking at ads, the more revenue for the company and for the sponsors of the ads. And that is not socially productive. So, yeah, I'm on a soapbox. Read the books, come to your own conclusions, and do away with this notion that I've held for 50 years. We're just technologists and we're doing our job the best way we can, and it's somebody else's problem. It isn't. It's our problem too. I don't want to end on a downer. I'm still a techno-optimist. I think we can make great stuff together, but we have to have a much broader sense of why we're doing it. And this is what I want to teach my students, and I want to help spread the gospel of be aware of the unintended consequences and the end goals as you design away. I apologize for overrunning. I'll let Daniel take control of the meeting again. I want a big hand for my Brown team who have pulled incredible effort to bring this off. Thank you, Brown team. Thank you.